let me talk a little bit about tape. Very interesting process of how it works. So if you've got a piece of tape, and this is going to be, let's say, a side view. You're looking at a cross-section of the tape, right? The tape would be 2,500 feet long, but let's just cut it and take a magnifying glass and blow it up and look at it from a side view for a second. You've got a piece of mylar, which is a thin piece of plastic, as the backing. And then on top of that, you've got all this magnetic material that gets glued onto it. In that magnetic material is a whole compound and a host of other kinds of materials. Now, why would you need that other than just magnetic materials that get glued onto a piece of plastic that goes by the head, it gets magnetized? Is because as it's going over the heads, this is metal oxide. It's like sort of similar to rust that you'd see on a nail, right? So it's sort of this reddish, dark material. And it gets glued onto this piece of mylar, and as the tape moves, it needs to be flexible enough not to crack, not to dry out, not to be to the point where you get it flaking off. So they put other materials in the formula so that it'll actually flow across the head. So you think about it, you've got metal across the metal head, scraping across it, unless they do something to make it flow easily. One of the things they used to put in it is little droplets of oil so that it would sort of lubricate it as it's being tensioned across the heads. And these little drops of oil, some formulas used to use whale oil. It was a very special kind of oil because it was light enough to be lubricating but still not leave a residue. I mean, there's all sorts of complexities to the chemistry of how tape formulas work. Just interesting to know that they put all sorts of other materials in this so that the tape would be able to slide across the heads without damaging the heads, without damaging the tape. And the fact is that if you look at, say, a top view of a piece of tape, let's say it's traveling this direction, and it's passing over the head, and magnetism is being spit out onto the tape, there's little magnetic particles in the tape because they're iron. And as the magnetism gets spit onto the tape, the particles will flip sides and become more lined up and magnetized in one little direction, and then tape moves along and it gets magnetized in another direction. So it's capturing the fluctuations of the electrical signal by fluctuating magnetic fields that magnetize certain parts of the tape in different intensities. When it's read back and played back, the head itself reads those magnetic intensity fluctuations and changes it back to electrical signals. Pretty complicated for analog recording, but that's how it works. To me, it's a marvel that they can do it. Of course, digital has its own marvels as to how it works as well. But this in itself is pretty spectacular. So you go, when we were talking about bias signals, why do you need a bias signal to get this to work right? Is because these magnetic particles are glued to the backing of the tape. So to get them to be free enough to be able to flip sides and align themselves magnetically, you have to sort of shake them up. And I kind of think of it as sort of a box full of marbles. These things are just sort of vibrating around, and then you can go ahead and they can move around much easier. If they were static and glued to the backing, it would take much more energy to get them to start moving and flipping. But that said, there's only so many atoms on the tape, so many molecules of iron oxide or ferrite oxide on the tape. So if the magnetic field is really great, only so many can align in one direction, and then it stops aligning because there's no more molecules to align because it's a finite number. And if there's a very weak signal of magnetism, very few of them will flip, and you'll get mostly just the noise of the tape running over the heads. So you've got a noise floor with tape, which we call tape hiss, and you've got an upper level of how much signal the tape can actually handle. This is all about gain structures and making sure you don't overload things and get distortion. Now the beautiful thing about it, and I probably touch on it later, I'll touch on it again, is that people sometimes think that analog tape machines and analog recordings, there's this sort of urban legend that it sounds better than digital recording, that analog tape is special and it's better than digital. Well, the reason that people say that sometimes is, and I don't know if I agree or not, because analog tape has its problems and its benefits. Digital has its problems and its benefits. And actually, at the end of this comparison, I'll list both so you can see a clear comparison of both. Even though you'll probably mostly work in the digital domain, there are times when I keep a tape machine around because I want to bounce out and hit tape and then bounce back into the digital domain so that I can capture that good sound that I like on analog. And what is the sound that I like on analog? Well, analog, it's not the electronics in the tape machine or the problems keeping the speed constant or any of that stuff. The sound I like on analog tape is the way the tape works to store the sound. So if you hit the tape with harder magnetic fields, it'll start flipping these magnetic particles and aligning them until there's very little left to align. So what happens is you get this declining sort of input keeps going up and the output sort of gets softer and softer and can't quite maintain a linear one-to-one relationship. So what you get is you get this kind of a system where you've got an input and an output on this tape, and you put more signal in, especially if it's biased properly. It should have worked linearly until you get up to the top of all of the molecules, and pretty soon there's no more to flip. And so your structure gets so that you can apply more input signal and you get the same or a little more output signal. It's like a compressor, and it's a physical compressor of how the tape works. And my contention that everything in the world sounds better when it's compressed, that's the reason, is because the balance of the harmonic structure against the fundamental frequency gets a little dynamically changed, as we discussed with compressors. And so naturally it'll sound better because you're hearing more of the harmonic structure as opposed to the fundamental. So you basically dynamically control the harmonic structure and alter it. So it's a very good sound. And so if you work the tape properly, and we used to be very expert at being able to how to bias the tape machine, how hard to hit it, how much signal to put into the tape machine, how little signal not to put in on various kinds of sounds. So cymbals, you don't want to hit the tape machine very hard at all. You want to keep it rather quiet because of all of the high frequency transients. You don't want to lose any of those. But when you hit it hard with a bass guitar or a kick drum and you really slam it into the tape, it thickens it up because of the property of the tape. And so you tend to get more bottom. You almost play the tape machine as if it was an instrument, if you're the engineer. It wasn't just a technical function of, okay, it's at 0, don't go over the 0, don't go into the red. I was told as a young engineer, never watch the meters, because it doesn't matter how the meters look. What matters is how it sounds. Nobody turns on the radio and goes, oh, that must have been in the red. They just go, wow, I like that sound. And I worked with many, many engineers that had their own techniques of working with the tape machine to create the sound that they were looking for. So it really is sort of a physical type of compressor that is a physical property of how the tape works. I'm glad I went through that dissertation because now you understand why some people say analog tape sounds so great. It's because the tape is compressing it. So let's get into the digital domain for a second. You know what? There were a lot of studios in the past that had these devices where you could record into the analog tape machine and then right into Pro Tools so you'd get that sound recorded. The problem is that when you're in the record mode, it's putting the signal onto the tape, and the playback head, which is later down the path, as you recall, we had the 3 heads, right? We've got the erase head, the record head, and the playback head, and the tape moves this direction. This is actually recording onto the tape, putting magnetic flux on the tape. This is reading back, playing back. And the distance between here and here is actually a delay because of the tape at the speed, depending on the speed. So you can't accurately overdub to something like that because you're always hearing a short delay. Incidentally, back in the early days of recording, say rockabilly and Elvis and late 50s, they used to use a tape machine to create that delay. So that's sort of the rockabilly delay sound. And it just happens at 15 inches per second with the old Ampex machines, the distance caused 160 millisecond delay. And if you go into your computer and you put 160 millisecond delay on your vocal, it's going to sound like an Elvis or a John Lennon kind of vocal effect. So the idea is a good idea. So what do? I record into Pro Tools first when I'm tracking drums and tracking everything. And then at a later time, I'll go and use my tape machine as if it were an outboard effect and go ahead and send it from Pro Tools to my tape machine and then play it back from my tape machine back and re-record it into Pro Tools. And it'll come back delayed, but in Pro Tools I can see the delay and I can move the tracks so that they're lined up with the original tracks, and then everything imprints that good analog tape sound on my digital tracks. And my contention is, as long as you hit one piece of analog tape, you get that analog sound. You don't have to record the whole project on 24-track analog, or even at the end of the process, after everything's recorded, you can end up bouncing your stereo master to an analog 2-track. And a lot of people do that because they want to get that analog sound because they still think it sounds really great. So if I send it from Pro Tools, record it, and then later play it back off the playback head because it's going to be delayed, take the signal off the playback head and re-record it into Pro Tools. It's going to be delayed, but I can move those tracks and put them back in synchronization in the computer. Much easier to move tracks in the computer than on analog tape. That's another thing, incidentally. Analog tape is very difficult to edit. I was very good at it, but it took a lot of work to be able to cut tape and splice it to other pieces. And if you got it wrong, the undo function wasn't just that easy. You had to take that piece of tape and put it back in place and retape it in place. But the beauty is that you could do that. You could cut pieces out, and we used to put analog tape machines, we'd tape them on the wall, and we'd write with grease pencil, this is the front, this is the back, because if you got it backwards, you paste it back in backwards, and all of a sudden your music's all backwards. And we say, okay, this is verse 1, this is chorus 2, that's the piece from the double chorus, there's the 2 bars we wanted to edit out of the arrangement, it's sitting over there on the wall. And so we tape it up on the wall sort of in this way that we could get to it quickly. Now when they say looping, right, I'm sure you've heard of being able to loop in Pro Tools. It really was tape loops that caused people to start talking that way. We used to take maybe 8 bars of a good drum performance, cut it out of a piece of analog tape, and tape the beginning to the end, and then we would put it back on the tape machine, and we'd have second engineers with mic stands holding the tape out around the room, and the tape would go and just loop. And then we'd take the output of that tape machine and record it on a new tape machine. So there were all sorts of tricks that you could do with analog tape that you could similarly do in Pro Tools, but much easier in Pro Tools. Or any digital device where you can just highlight a section, say loop play, and it just loops. It's a whole different process. Much easier to use digital, but still the analog sounds were really good too. So there's something to be said for that. And actually the limitations forced you to do things differently.